Good evening. I am Pastor Bob Uzzle from the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Corsicana, Texas. This is Sunday, July 26, 2020, and I hope everybody has had a good day. I want to pay tribute this evening to one of my favorite authors, certainly my favorite contributor to the field of psychology, a man by the name of Carl Gustav Jung, born July 26, 1875, in Switzerland, which means that he would be 145 if he were still living today. Carl Jung, to me, is a very interesting man. And by the way, Jung is spelled Jung. He was often, his name comes up in connection with Sigmund Freud, although Freud is by far the better known of the two men. He was older by 19 years. I don't care a whole lot for Freud, but I think Jung was quite brilliant, and I really have been greatly influenced by his theories. It's been a number of years since I've had the pleasure of teaching a course in psychology of religion. When I've done so, Jung has always been my primary focus. Freud and Jung were very different in the sense of two major ways. Freud was Jewish, but was an atheist. Jung, on the other hand, was the son of a pastor in the Reformed Calvinist tradition in his home country of Switzerland. While Jung did not follow in his dad's footsteps into the ministry, he was certainly greatly influenced by spiritual concepts. He received the degree of Doctor of Medicine and eventually became a psychiatrist. And he was one of the first to bring psychology into psychiatry. He served for a while as a staff psychiatrist in a mental hospital in Switzerland. Then he settled down in Zurich and devoted the rest of his life to private practice and to writing. He was, from an early age, very interested in science and also very interested in the humanities. He was particularly intrigued with everything related to the Egyptians and the Babylonians, the ancient cultures and civilizations. I mentioned he had differences with Freud. They were associated for about 7 years. Then they had a parting of the ways when Jung published his book, Symbols of Transformation. He defined the libido as psychic energy in general, in which sexuality was only one element of it, not the total picture. Freud associated everything with sexuality, even spirituality was nothing more than repressed sexuality, whereas Jung took a much more broad view of the matter. He saw spirituality and sexuality of having dimensions all their own. And you can give an example of, say, for example, a young female patient comes in and, since both men did much to analyze dreams, the young lady's having dreams of a snake in her stomach. Freud would jump to the conclusion, very simple explanation, the snake's a phallic symbol. Jung say, no, not so quick. Maybe, maybe not. There might be another explanation. It might be the Kundalini, the serpent of paradise that plays an important role in Hindu mythology. And the stress would be not anything sexual, but moving toward wholeness, to what Jung described as individuation. Early in his career, he became very much interested in the Gnostics, the early heretics that were denounced by the Church Fathers. It was in 1916, shortly after his break with Freud, that he had some very interesting experiences. He tried to focus on what's called confrontation with the unconscious. I have so many books by and about Jung. Here is his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. Obviously, quite well read. And he described this experience, and he wrote using the name of Basilides, the 2nd century Egyptian Gnostic, in what became known as Septem Sermones ad Mortuos, 7 sermons to the dead. And in that, he identifies himself with the Basilides and gives God the name of Abraxas. This is an interesting study by Bishop Stephen Heller of the Gnostic Church, the Gnostic Jung, and the 7 sermons to the dead. I used this decades back in a major writing of mine. This is a famous picture of Basilides drawing the concept of Abraxas with a head of a rooster, a human torso, and serpent legs being pulled by a chariot of white horses. And it was an ancient mystical concept that Jung became quite intrigued with. The Gnostic Jung and the 7 sermons to the dead is interesting work. Initially, Jung made copies of the 7 sermons as a pamphlet. He gave it to his friends, but it was never widely circulated until toward the end of his life. It was never available in bookstores. And as he was coming to the end and stressing the sake of honesty, he decided to allow it to be published as part of his memoirs. And another work that came out of the same period of the confrontation with the unconscious is called The Red Book. And it was, during his lifetime, he never allowed the Red Book to be published. And his heirs were, he died on June the 6th, 1961, and his heirs were even more secretive than he was. Finally, in 2009, almost 50 years after his death, the Red Book was finally published. And of course, it's very interesting work, to say the least. But Carl Jung went further than Freud did in dealing with dreams and with dealing with visions, with the unconscious. Both men had the belief that much of our mental life operates not on the conscious level, but on the unconscious level. But Freud spoke strictly in terms of an individual unconscious. Jung felt like they went further than that, and there was a collective unconscious in which all mankind had a share. He referred to the elements of the collective unconscious as archetypes, and much of his writings deals with archetypal symbolism. He wrote, for years, he felt like there was a connection between the ancient Gnostic teachings and the modern psychology of the unconscious. And he felt like there had to be a missing link somewhere. Then he felt like he finally discovered that missing link in an ancient magical practice known as alchemy. One of his major works is Psychology and Alchemy. Who were the alchemists? They spent time in the laboratory. If you ever taken a chemistry course, you might look at the first chapter of the textbook. It will give you a little brief overview of the history of chemistry, and will give at least passing reference to the alchemist who, laid the foundation for some of the stuff that later chemists were able to do. It took a long time before they finally arrived at it. But the uh, the alchemists worked in the laboratories trying to turn lead into gold. But Carl Jung argued there was not just a scientific thing, but there was a psychological and spiritual meaning to what the alchemists were actually doing within the fool's art of gold making. So I've often said that Carl Jung had more influence on us theologians. I'm not a psychologist. Us theologians than he did upon psychologists and psychiatrists. They try to be so scientific in their approach, whereas Carl Jung was a mystic. I have many different books that he wrote, and some written by others about him. This one illustrated biography by Clara Dunn is called Carl Jung, Wounded Healer of the Soul. C.G. Jung, The Haunted Prophet by Paul J. Stern, is a more critical iconoclastic work. The last of his books was Man and His Symbols. I think it was completed 10 days before his final illness. Ernest Jones, a psychology professor, published a book entitled Conversations with Carl Jung. I was told you wrong. There's actually his last work was, not Modern Man in Search of a Soul, but Man and His Symbols. And here's some collected works of essays on contemporary events. The late Jungian analyst Ernie Bell was a friend of mine, and we had lunch in 1985 because when I was beginning my research on Abraxas. And Ernie, I talked to him about many things, including the essay Carl Jung wrote in the 1930s called Wotan, which was used in the study of the psychology of Nazism. And Ernie told me said, Wotan is dated. You need to read after the catastrophe, which I certainly did. But it was his long and productive life really contributed so much to so many different things. In 1925, he made a safari to East Africa. He visited Kenya, and he went up the Nile River from the south into Egypt. And here's a friend of mine, Blake Burleson, wrote this book, Jung in Africa. And it's interesting that Jung would write this. He wrote it in had this experience, this safari in 1925. He was 50 years old at the time, right in the middle of his career. And so many of the concepts that was developed by this European psychologist was rooted in his experiences while in Africa. Here's a collected work of his writings about dreams. And also, this mentioned Blake Burleson, there's his contemplative approach to understanding world religions. We were at the same luncheon on the Baylor campus 5 years ago. We came to attend the celebration of 50th anniversary of Baylor's PhD program, of which we're both graduated, and Blake presented me a copy of this book about Carl Jung, autographed it for me, and I presented him a copy of my book, The Durhams of Fairfield, an African American Genealogy. I also have copies of 2 books that were written by a late friend of mine, Dr. James Hall, The Jungian Experience, Analysis and Individuation, and Jungian Dream Interpretation. Dr. Hall was a psychiatrist who practiced in Dallas several years ago, and he's since passed away, but he was a great contributor to this field. There's Jungian groups all over. I've never been active in one. My son and I attended a vernal equinox celebration in Dallas in 2011 at the St. Thomas Episcopal Church. It was sponsored by the C.G. Jung Society of North Texas. During my period of employment at Terrell State Hospital in the 1980s, uh, it wasn't true of everybody there, but there was only a small number of us connected with the institution that had a big interest in Jung. But there were a few of us who ended up having some interesting conversations. And that was when I began my research on Abraxas. I had first came across Abraxas in Waco. There was a nightclub operated in the early 1970s called the Abraxas Club. And it was served as an R&R place for activists with the La Razanita Party, a third party that was active at the time, part of the Chicano movement. And while the owners and operators of the club were all Mexican American, there was an openness to people of all nationalities to come and have a good time. Tony Calhoun passed away just in the last year. He was an African American musician in Waco and a very good one. He reported that it was at the Abraxas Club that he first partied with Mexicans, and Anglos, Hispanics, African Americans, didn't matter. Mixed couples were welcome. In Waco in the early 1970s, that was unusual. But they had some good performances there. Alexandria at the time of Basilides was a melting pot. The Chinese had not yet arrived, but otherwise Africa, Asia, and Europe freely mixed, converged in this city along the banks of the Nile. And it was the teachings of Basilides that influenced Carl Jung in the writing of 7 Sermons to the Dead. One of Jung's most famous patients was the German novelist Hermann Hesse, who wrote about Abraxas in his book Demian. And there's a place in Demian in which he said, I stood before it and began to freeze inside from the exertion. I questioned the painting, berated it, made love to it, prayed to it. I called it mother. I called it whore and slut. I called it my beloved. I called it Abraxas. And those words, with slight variation, appear on the back of the 1970 album by Santana, the Mexican rock group, called Abraxas. The most famous song from the Santana album is Black Magic Woman. And the name of this album by Carlos Santana influenced the establishment of the Waco Abraxas Club. And one of my favorite stories is when I was doing my research back in the 80s, I was explaining at the Espinosa's Ice House. The Espinosas were involved in this particular movement with La Razanita and establishing Abraxas. I was explaining about this, and one of the customers made the statement, I drank a few beers at the Abraxas Club. I said, there's more to Abraxas than drinking beer. Yeah. We're talking about an ancient esoteric symbol. But these symbols have universal application. And dealing with Jung's ideas, like Ernie Bell and I were talking about that, he said it's still connected on the unconscious level, if not on the conscious level. There's so many things that are tied together here. When I was teaching psychology of religion, my son-in-law and I were discussing this today. He's my former student. And another one of our friends from San Antonio was in the class. And one of the questions I would always ask on the final exam when I taught psychology of religion, analyze one of your own dreams. And analyze it based on what you've learned this semester. Well, fellow didn't do too well in answering the question. He didn't really make a good shot at it, in my opinion. He dreamed about a young lady. And I said he should have interpreted the young lady as his anima. Anima is the feminine image in the masculine psyche. Animus is the masculine image in the feminine psyche. And they're not the way a the anima is not the way the woman actually is, but it's the way the man perceives her to be. The animus is not the way the man actually is, but the way the woman perceives him to be. And that distinction has got to be understood. But obviously, being male, Jung had more experience in dealing with the anima than with the animus. And some of his ideas that have often been misunderstood. By the way, he's the one who came up with the term introversion and extroversion. And when the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders was being revised once, one proposal was to include a category of introverted personality disorder, but it was withdrawn due to protests from Jungians because some people are more introverted than others, some people are more extroverted than others, but that's not abnormal. That doesn't mean there's anything dysfunctional or functional or pathological. That's just the way people are. So, trying to say there's anything that's not a disorder, it's just some people are more in and some are more out. Simple as that. Nobody's 100% introverted or 100% extroverted, but we all carry some characteristics of both. And the concept of the shadow is the dark side of the personality. And there's misunderstanding of it because it is not something that's understood to be evil. It's just the idea that certain things that are denied, if they're repressed too long, can come forth and do some damage. You see your shadow. You confront many of these things. And unless these hidden elements, these things that are repressed, are dealt with in a positive manner, there can be some serious problems. In the book I mentioned earlier, the fight with the shadow was a broadcast in 1946 on British Broadcasting Corporation. So this is shortly after World War II, in which Jung understood these things and tried to express them. He was quite unfairly described as a Nazi sympathizer. He saw Hitler as a phenomenon to be studied, but never sympathized with what Hitler stood for. He saw the awakening of Wotan, the ancient Germanic deity, and the rise of National Socialism. And it gives a very interesting psychological interpretation of these things that were going on at that time. But many of his closest disciples were Jewish, and he was not anti-Semitic at all. And he came to America. He studied the Native Americans out of New Mexico. He did some writing on the psychology of African Americans, and on, of course, as I said before, the time he spent in Africa was very significant as far as his psychology was concerned. He also had a great deal of interest in India and the psychology of many of these religions. My doctorate is in world religions. I devoted a lifetime to studying these various traditions. And there's some good you find and some bad you find in all of them. And using like Blake has talked about a contemplative approach to understanding world religions. C.G. Jung as a phenomenologist of the soul, and how his psychological concepts can be applied to the study of world religions. He was truly a fascinating man, and the in the almost 86 years he lived on this earth, he accomplished so much. 145 years ago today. Happy birthday, Carl Jung.